He stood by his car, hands cuffed, as the crowd murmured in disbelief. Officer Wilson, unaware of his mistake, led the offender to the squad car. No one knew this wasn't just any man. It was the city's mayor. What happened next shook the entire town. But let's start from the beginning. Officer Jacob Wilson, a disciplined yet rigid enforcer of the law in Riverdale, prided himself on being a symbol of authority. His day, like any other, began with a meticulous patrol of the town's streets. But as he cruised past City Hall, his attention snapped to a black luxury car, slightly edging over the faded white line of a parking space. It was the kind of detail he couldn't ignore. The driver stepped out, a tall, confident black man in his early 40s, dressed in a sharp navy suit that seemed to command respect. Jacob's brows furrowed as he sized up the man. Something about him, or perhaps everything about him, triggered an instinctive rigidity in the officer. "Sir, you're parked illegally," Jacob announced, his voice sharp and authoritative. The man turned, his demeanor calm and composed. "I believe I'm within the rules. If I've made a mistake, I'll move," he replied, his tone polite, almost conciliatory. But Jacob wasn't having it. He fixated on the slight encroachment of the vehicle, an infraction so minor it would have likely gone unnoticed on any other day. Yet today, Jacob's unspoken prejudices worked their way to the surface, clouding his judgment. "License and registration, now," Jacob barked, his demand cutting through the air. The man complied without hesitation, retrieving the requested documents and handing them over. "Michael Carter," the man introduced himself calmly, but Jacob barely glanced at the name on the paperwork. "You think being polite gets you off the hook?" he said, his tone sharper now, designed to assert dominance. A small crowd began to gather, their hushed whispers creating a palpable tension in the air. "Officer, I have a meeting in City Hall, an important one," Michael began, his voice steady. Jacob raised a hand to silence him. "You're not going anywhere," he interrupted, stepping forward. Without another word, he pulled out handcuffs and secured them around Michael's wrists. The crowd gasped. Some reached for their phones, capturing the unfolding scene. Jacob, however, remained oblivious to the storm he had just unleashed. Sitting in the back of the police car, Michael Carter stared through the bars on the window, his composed facade beginning to crack. His breath slowed, but his thoughts raced, dragging him back to every moment of prejudice and injustice he had endured. This wasn't just about the cuffs digging into his wrists. It was about the stinging humiliation of being reduced to a stereotype. Outside, the murmurs of onlookers still echoed in his mind, the disbelief on their faces almost as painful as the indignity of the situation itself. When they arrived at the station, the atmosphere shifted. Michael stepped out, his posture unbroken despite the weight of the moment. Officer Jacob Wilson remained steadfast, his expression one of self-satisfaction, as he escorted his perpetrator inside. Behind the front desk stood Sergeant Claire Edwards, a seasoned officer whose commanding presence could silence a room. She glanced up from her paperwork as Jacob approached with Michael. Her eyes immediately locked onto the man in cuffs. Her brow furrowed, recognition flickering across her face like a warning signal. "Officer Wilson," she said, her tone sharp but controlled, "do you realize who this is?" Jacob shrugged dismissively. "Another guy who thinks the rules don't apply to him," he replied, his voice tinged with arrogance. Claire's expression darkened, her glare slicing through Jacob like a blade. "This," she said slowly, enunciating every word, "is Mayor Michael Carter." The color drained from Jacob's face in an instant, his previous bravado crumbling into stunned silence. He turned to look at Michael, who met his gaze with quiet, piercing intensity. Without a word, Claire unlocked the cuffs, her movements quick and deliberate. Michael rubbed his wrists, but said nothing until the silence in the room became almost unbearable. "I'll be filing a formal complaint," Michael said, his voice steady, every syllable carrying the weight of dignity and authority. The quiet that followed was deafening, leaving Jacob to grapple with the enormity of his actions while Michael walked away, his presence towering even in its calm. News of the arrest swept through the city like a storm. Within hours, the footage captured by bystanders had gone viral, flooding social media feeds with outrage and disbelief. The video showed Officer Jacob Wilson handcuffing Mayor Michael Carter, with captions denouncing systemic bias and questioning the fairness of law enforcement. Hashtags like #JusticeForCarter and #EndBiasInBlue trended nationwide, sparking a broader conversation about implicit bias and accountability. The streets of Riverdale soon filled with protesters, their chants echoing through the city. Signs demanding justice and systemic reform filled the air, carried by citizens who were no longer willing to stay silent. The arrest had become a flashpoint, a symbol of the inequities that many had felt, but never voiced. Amid the uproar, Michael Carter's voice stood out, calm but resolute. When reporters swarmed him for comment, he refused to fan the flames of anger. "This isn't just about what happened to me," he said during a press conference, his tone measured but firm. "It's about addressing the deeper issue of implicit bias in our system. Officer Wilson made a mistake, but mistakes are opportunities for growth, not division." His words struck a chord, shifting the narrative from vengeance to constructive change. The city organized a public forum to address the incident, with citizens, officials, and activists packing the hall. Michael was the first to speak. Taking the podium, he shared his personal experiences with discrimination, his voice steady yet deeply emotional. He spoke not just as a victim, but as a leader determined to turn this moment into a catalyst for progress. His words resonated, earning him standing ovations and renewed respect from his community. When Jacob Wilson's turn came, the room fell silent. He stepped forward, his usual confidence replaced with visible unease. Facing the crowd, he took a deep breath and said, "I let my biases guide my actions, and I'm deeply sorry. I have a lot to learn, and I'm committed to doing better." His humility surprised many, opening a door to dialogue and reflection rather than further division. The forum ended with a sense of cautious hope, a belief that this moment, born of injustice, might pave the way for a better future. Jacob Wilson's path to redemption began with a decision that many in his position might have avoided. Confronted with the consequences of his actions, he voluntarily enrolled in a comprehensive bias training program, a step that required both humility and courage. The program was grueling, designed to challenge deeply ingrained prejudices and foster empathy. Jacob didn't just attend. He fully immersed himself, often staying after sessions to ask questions and reflect. But training alone wasn't enough. Jacob knew he had to face the community he had wronged. He began attending town hall meetings, sitting down with activists, educators, and local leaders to understand their perspectives. At first, his presence was met with skepticism, even hostility. However, over time, his sincerity became undeniable. He didn't make excuses or try to defend his past actions. Instead, he listened, learned, and committed to making amends. Jacob's transformation didn't just change him, it inspired others. His willingness to grow became a symbol of hope for Riverdale, proof that even those who falter can rise to become agents of change. Meanwhile, Michael Carter's leadership shone brighter than ever. The incident had placed him under a national spotlight, but instead of using it to seek personal vindication, he focused on systemic change. Michael worked tirelessly to implement police reform in Riverdale, advocating for policies that emphasized education, accountability, and community engagement. He partnered with experts to develop mandatory bias training for law enforcement and introduced citizen oversight committees to ensure transparency. At the closing ceremony of the Reform Initiative, Michael addressed the city with words that would echo far beyond Riverdale. Justice isn't about punishment. It's about making things right. His speech, filled with hope and vision, resonated deeply with everyone present. The story of Michael Carter and Jacob Wilson became a beacon of inspiration, showing the nation that empathy and accountability can lead to true progress. Riverdale transformed into a model of unity and reform, a testament to what's possible when individuals and communities choose growth over division.